I'd like to start by sharing a story. There's a coast, and there are two schools, School A and School B. Between these two schools, there's a main road. The boundary line which dictates which students in which houses go to which school runs along the main road. Because School A is closer to the coast, the median house price is higher, and therefore the students that go to School A have a higher level of socioeconomic advantage. So green here means upper class, yellow means middle class, and red means lower class. Because School B is further from the coast, the level of advantage for students at School B is lower relative to School A. Because School B is perceived to have more behavioural problems, and School A is placed in a nicer area, so it's seen to have better resources, high-achieving students from School B desire to go to School A, as they believe they'll have better outcomes and better opportunities at School A. And what this does is it creates a large imbalance in the level of advantage between School A and School B. But what I haven't told you is that School B is the school that I teach at. As was mentioned before, my name is Inder, and I'm the head of mathematics and science at a disadvantaged school in metropolitan Perth. I started out studying chemical engineering and chemistry here at UWA. I then went on to do the Teach for Australia Leadership Development Program, doing my Masters of Teaching. Following this, I've taught at two socioeconomically disadvantaged schools here in Perth. When I was studying chemical engineering, one of my friends made a rather crude generalisation that stuck with me to this day. And that's that electrical engineers, they deal with the electrical parts, mechanical engineers deal with the mechanical part, or the moving parts, civil and structural engineers deal with the non-moving parts, but chemical engineers, they look at the whole thing. They look at the big picture from start to finish. And the purpose of chemical engineering is to take raw, unrefined resources and materials and put them through a process that allows them to become more refined and more usable. I'm not in chemical engineering, but I think I'm doing something a little bit similar, but not with inanimate objects, with people. How do we take raw students, for lack of a better term, and value add to them so that they're more refined and can contribute more positively to society? I think the answer lies somewhere in here. And what I believe this should look like is dictated by my vision for education in Australia. That all children, regardless of background, are entitled to an excellent education. There's a lot of research being done at the moment about what an excellent education looks like, as dictated by high rates of learning. But there's another part to this. How every student at every school can have access to that which we're offering. And this is the part that I'd like to talk about today. More advantaged schools typically tend to have access to better quality teaching, better resources, and also a more positive school climate. There was a study done by the Program of International Students Assessments, PISA, and they looked at the average school science scores and compared the difference between advantaged schools and disadvantaged schools. And what they found was that the difference between advantaged and disadvantaged schools was 100 points. This equates to about 3 years worth of learning. So you could take one student in an advantaged school and another in a disadvantaged school, and what you would find is the difference in science knowledge would be roughly 3 years, which is pretty significant. But it's not just about academic outcomes. Another issue we have to be mindful of is something called social segregation, which put simply is just the splitting of social classes. So upper classes, middle classes, and lower classes all being separated from each other. In the same study by PISA, out of 71 countries that were surveyed, first being the most socially segregated, the most splitting between classes, Australia was actually ranked 8th. Which might be surprising to some of you. Trevor Cobbold on the Save Our Schools website referred to social segregation as a double jeopardy effect. He said that not only are students disadvantaged because of their conditions at home when they come from a disadvantaged background, but also when they're socially segregated, more disadvantage is imposed on them as well. So in other words, more social segregation leads to worse educational outcomes for students and also a wider achievement gap between those that are advantaged and those that are disadvantaged. But it's not just academic outcomes, as I said before. Social segregation is shown to lead to poorer expectations for the future for those students from disadvantaged backgrounds. It's shown to lead to greater social intolerance within communities and workplaces, and also damaged social empathy, as well as decreased capacity for social groups to coexist. So it's not just about how students are doing well in school, but it has implications for how different classes, cultures, and groups actually integrate in society, which has really big implications for how productive we are as a country and as a community. So a lot of people try and solve this, and the first thing that people jump to is that why don't we throw more money? Why don't we put more resources into schools to help fix this? And what I can tell you is that factoring in inflation, increased wage inflation in the education system, and also the increased population of those that are attending school in Australia, the amount of funding going into the education system has actually steadily increased over time. But if we look at results for high-stakes testing, such as Year 9 NAPLAN, what we see here is that there's a stagnation. Those that are meeting the national minimum standard, the percentage for that is actually staying relatively the same. No matter what the strand is, no matter what area they're testing, the amount of students meeting that standard is fairly stagnant. This might just be for Year 9, but I can assure you that it's pretty much the same for all the different year groups that are tested. So what I'm proposing is that it's not necessarily money that's the be-all and end-all solution. Sometimes it helps, but what I think we need to be looking at is how do we best use the resources and money that we already have to produce the best outcomes possible. So back to this problem. I told you before that the boundary line that separates School A and School B runs along the main road. What I propose we do in this situation is we put it perpendicular to the main road. What this means is that School A and School B both share the coastline, so there's a bit of a reshuffle in terms of the advantage of the students attending those schools. It might not be a perfect balance in reality, but I think it's going to reduce the risk of students wanting to move to another school because they perceive it as being better. This is just one solution to one unique problem. And what I'd like to do is share one area that can help to reduce the effects of socioeconomic disadvantage in schools and use my own school's examples to show how we make that happen. This area I'd like to focus on is a supportive school climate and an environment for learning. School climate, or a positive school climate, has been shown to narrow achievement gaps not just between advantaged and disadvantaged students, but also between high achieving and low achieving students. So a positive school climate is useful no matter what school you're in. It helps to decrease the gap between students that have a difference in how they're achieving. At the school that I'm teaching at, our school vision is centred on inviting students to learn. What this means is that students aren't coerced. What we do is we build a climate where students want to be invited in, where they have buy-in and have a sense of ownership over the learning process. How we target these key areas of improvement is based on 5 major values. These are intentionality, optimism, care, respect, and trust. So everything we do is through the lens of intentionality, care, optimism, respect, and trust. When we engage with students, when we engage with colleagues, is it with care? Is it with optimism? Every decision that we make, every policy that we change, it's intentional. And we do it with optimism, we do it with respect, trust at the center of this, using it as a lens for change. What we decide to change and what we target is what we call the 5 Ps. People, places, policies, programs, and processes. These are the 5 things that we always target and reflect on to make sure that when we're changing, we're very specific in what we want to change, making sure that each of those changes are intentional, caring, optimistic, respectful, and trusting. So let me give you an example. If a student's below benchmark, if they're getting a D or E grade, if we notice they've slipped behind what they're normally achieving, whatever that is, and that student needs to be caught up. What we do is we look at data, we look at how classes are tracking, we look at how individuals are tracking, we look at how the cohort's tracking. We're constantly looking at data every 5 weeks, so we have a really clear picture and a really clear indication of how those students are tracking and when we need to intervene. Following that, we then ask a series of questions based on our 5 Ps. So in terms of people, places, policies, programs, and processes, we ask, are there problems with engagement or participation of students? What can I do as a person to change, to improve my practice? How can I best meet the needs of these people in my class? And we ask a series of questions based on these 5 Ps. So for places, we say, is the classroom inviting? Policies, are the rules and expectations inviting? And we basically use these as a framework to invoke change through the lens of our 5 values to make sure that students have buy-in and there's a positive school climate so they want to be a part of that learning process. If I was to boil down the whole problem of socioeconomic disadvantage into 2 words, first would be data. We need to know that social segregation and socioeconomic disadvantage are a real thing. And we need to know what research tells us about how we can minimize the effects of it happening. We also need to understand the data in our schools, both looking at individuals, classes, and the broader school, and identify areas of risk and need. And secondly, the other word is equity. How can we make sure that every child in every school has access to education, an excellent education? Thank you.